Hey everyone, welcome back. Just before we start, it's a fun idea if you type in where you're listening from. Thanks, like and subscribe, and let's get this started. Our marriage, from the outside, appeared seamless. People often remarked on how perfect we were together. Jessica, with her effortless charm and grace, and me, the dependable, hardworking husband. We had the house, the lifestyle, and the appearances of a life many would envy. But as I now know, appearances can be deceiving. Jessica and I had been married for 7 years. It wasn't a number I paid particular attention to, but lately, it had become something of a marker. A milestone that seemed to weigh heavier on her than on me. I started noticing little things, small, seemingly inconsequential details that, at first, didn't alarm me. Jessica had always been independent, and I never questioned her need for privacy. It was one of the things I respected about her. She was her own person, and I wasn't one to suffocate her with suspicion. After all, trust was the foundation of our marriage. Yet something about her began to change. She had always been careful with her phone, but recently I noticed she carried it everywhere. In the past, it would lay casually on the kitchen counter or left abandoned in the living room while she moved about the house. Now it was either firmly in her grip or tucked away in her bag, even when we were just watching TV. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe work had her more on edge, or maybe she was dealing with something personal that she didn't feel like sharing yet. I was never one to pry. Then there were the late nights. Jessica had always been committed to her job, and late meetings were a natural part of that commitment, but the frequency had increased. She started coming home later and later, her explanations about work obligations becoming vague, almost rehearsed. Still, I didn't want to read too much into it. We all go through phases, don't we? It wasn't until I noticed her behavior change around me that the nagging feeling I had suppressed began to grow into something I couldn't ignore. She had become distracted. There were moments when we would be sitting together and she would be physically present, but her mind was elsewhere. I tried asking her about it once, in a casual way, over dinner. "You seem a bit distant lately," I had said, trying to keep my tone light, non-accusatory. "Is everything okay?" She looked up from her plate, startled, as if I had caught her mid-thought. "What? Oh yeah, everything's fine, just work. You know how it is." Her response felt rushed, almost defensive. I let it slide. But that was the moment the unease began to settle into my bones. Jessica was lying, or at least hiding something, and I wasn't sure what to do with that realization. The next few weeks continued in a strange, tense rhythm. Jessica kept her distance emotionally, though she maintained the facade of normalcy. We still shared our meals, still went through the motions of our life together, but something vital had shifted. My instincts, sharpened over the years of navigating life's challenges, told me something was wrong. I had always trusted those instincts, and they had never led me astray. I found myself watching her more closely. Subtly, of course. I wasn't about to become the paranoid husband, interrogating my wife over every suspicious glance or late-night work meeting. But I noticed. I noticed the way she would disappear into her office at odd hours, claiming to need privacy for a conference call. I noticed how her laughter, once so spontaneous and free when we were together, now felt forced, almost like an obligation. And I noticed the way she flinched when I asked her simple questions about her day. It was as though a small fracture had appeared in the foundation of our marriage, barely visible but slowly spreading. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Still, I told myself that it could be anything. Work stress, a personal issue she didn't feel ready to share. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I had always prided myself on being rational, logical, a man who didn't let emotions cloud his judgment. But no matter how hard I tried to push it aside, the truth was staring me in the face. Jessica was slipping away from me. Something or someone had taken her attention away from our life, our marriage, and I needed to know what or who it was. That night, as I lay in bed next to her, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. I wasn't going to demand explanations or accusations that would only drive her further into whatever secret she was hiding. No, I was going to wait, watch, and find out the truth on my terms. Jessica had her secrets, but soon enough I would know them all. And when I did, I wouldn't be the weak, heartbroken husband begging for answers. I would be the one in control. It happened so quickly, so subtly, that at first, I didn't even recognize the significance of the moment. The house was quiet. Jessica had left her phone on the kitchen counter, the same phone she guarded as if her life depended on it. Normally, she would never leave it unattended, not even for a moment. But that morning, in her rush to make it to her early meeting, she'd forgotten it. I noticed it immediately when I walked into the kitchen. The screen was lit up with a notification. For a split second, I hesitated. I knew that once I crossed that line, once I unlocked the truth, there would be no going back. But the gnawing suspicion that had been building for weeks, the unease that kept me up at night, left me with no choice. My hand moved almost instinctively. I swiped the screen open, and there it was, messages from Ryan. The first one was innocuous enough, a single "good morning" from a number I didn't recognize. But as I scrolled through the conversation, the casual flirtation became unmistakably intimate. Their messages were filled with plans to meet, comments about how much they missed each other, and more that I couldn't bear to read. It wasn't just the words that struck me, it was the tone, the ease with which they communicated, the level of comfort. It wasn't a fling. This had been going on for some time. My world didn't shatter in that instant. Instead, something much colder settled in my chest. The hurt, the anger, the betrayal, it all crystallized into a steely resolve. I could have confronted her right then. I could have hurled accusations, demanded answers. But that would be too easy for her, too simple. I wasn't interested in watching her cry, offering up apologies or excuses that I knew would mean nothing. No, I wanted something different. I placed the phone back on the counter exactly where she had left it. The texts from Ryan were burned into my memory, but I knew there would be more. There always was. Instead of confronting her, I would collect the evidence, let her feel safe in her lies, let her believe she had me fooled. By the time Jessica came home that evening, I had made my decision. "How was your day?" she asked, setting her keys down by the door, her voice casual, like nothing had changed. She smiled at me, and I smiled back, but my mind was elsewhere. "Same as always," I replied. "Busy? How about yours?" "Exhausting," she said, running a hand through her hair. "Work has been relentless lately. I might need to travel for a few days next week." I nodded, barely listening. I already knew what her real plans were. "Well, I'm glad you're home now," I said. "We should have a quiet night, just the two of us." She agreed, and for the rest of the evening, we played our parts as husband and wife. But every time she looked at me, every time she spoke, I could see it, the lie. And I let it happen, let her live in the illusion that she was still in control. But as she drifted off to sleep that night, I lay awake, my mind calculating every step of what would come next. The next morning, I left for work as usual, but my first stop wasn't the office. I called in a favor with an old friend who had experience in private investigations. I needed tracking software, something discreet, something she wouldn't notice. He didn't ask questions. He simply sent what I needed. I installed the software on her phone the next night while she was in the shower. It took less than 5 minutes, and when she came out, she found me exactly where I had been, sitting on the bed, flipping through a magazine, as if nothing had changed. From that point on, I had a front row seat to her affair. I knew when she met Ryan, where they went, what they talked about. I could see their messages, hear their calls. It was almost surreal, like watching a play unfold in real time, except this wasn't fiction. This was my life. What struck me most was the banality of it all. The same cliches, the same tired lines. She told him how unhappy she was, how she felt trapped, how she didn't know how to leave me. I almost laughed when I read it. Trapped? Jessica had always been free. I had never been the type to control her, never questioned her decisions, never demanded more than what she offered. And yet, here she was playing the victim in a drama she had written herself. Ryan was younger, ambitious, and just as deceitful. He worked in her office, someone she had mentored, someone who now leveraged their affair to get what he wanted from her. In one particularly nauseating message, he told her she needed to push harder for his promotion, or he would take matters into his own hands. blackmailing her for career advancement. How fitting. But I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I started to gather everything. Screenshots of their conversations, audio recordings of their calls, timestamps, locations. I wasn't just going to confront them. I was going to bury them. But it had to be perfect. The timing, the execution, everything had to be flawless. I could feel the anticipation building inside me, but I forced myself to be patient. The longer I waited, the more careless they became. Jessica had no idea how much I knew. She continued her life, thinking she was playing me for a fool. I played along, making her believe I was none the wiser. I became more affectionate, more attentive, which only made her guilt easier to manipulate. I could see it in the way she responded to me, hesitating before answering my questions, her smiles never quite reaching her eyes. She was starting to crack, and I knew it. The opportunity I had been waiting for came one evening when Jessica mentioned a business trip to New York. Another lie. She wasn't going to New York for work. She was going to meet Ryan. It was the perfect setup, and I knew exactly how to use it. New York sounds great, I said, keeping my tone light. I'll miss you, though. She smiled, relieved that I hadn't questioned her. It'll only be a few days. I'll be back before you know it. But I wasn't going to wait for her to come back. As soon as she left, I set my plan into motion. I contacted Ryan's boss anonymously, sending them the screenshots of his conversations with Jessica, strategically leaving out her name. It was enough to suggest inappropriate behavior, enough to make them question his loyalty to the company. It was only a matter of time before the fallout hit. Ryan's career was about to implode, and he had no idea. Next, I began to plant seeds of doubt in Jessica's professional life. Using a burner phone, I sent incriminating tips to her company's HR department. Nothing too obvious, but enough to raise suspicions. I had been careful, calculated, and now all I had to do was wait. The pieces were falling into place. The night before Jessica was set to return, I received the news I had been waiting for. Ryan had been called in for a meeting with his superiors. From what I gathered through Jessica's texts, he was panicking, unsure of who had turned him in. He had no idea that the destruction of his career had been orchestrated by the very man whose life he thought he had stolen. Jessica, meanwhile, was oblivious to the chaos she was about to walk back into. She still thought she had control, still believed that she could keep her secret safe. But in just a few short days, her entire world would come crashing down around her. I wasn't just going to expose her affair. I was going to dismantle every aspect of her life, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. She had taken everything from me, my trust, my love, my dignity. Now I would take everything from her. And the best part, she wouldn't see it coming. The pieces were falling into place, each one clicking with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Jessica had no idea, and Ryan was oblivious, too busy feeding his ambition to notice the walls slowly closing in around him. But I noticed everything. After Jessica's business trip, things between her and Ryan intensified. The messages they exchanged became more frequent, more daring. It was almost as if the trip had emboldened them, given them the illusion that they could continue without consequence. They spoke of how they missed each other, made plans to meet in secret, and discussed what their lives might be like without me in the picture. I watched it all unfold, reading their fantasies like a novel in real time. It was pathetic. Ryan especially was growing bolder. His texts became more demanding, pushing Jessica to confront me or leave me altogether. He wanted to advance in his career, and he was using her as leverage to get there. The more I learned about him, the clearer his motivations became. It wasn't love, it was opportunism. He had latched onto her because he saw her as a stepping stone, a way to climb higher in the company, to gain power. And Jessica, blinded by the thrill of it all, couldn't see what he was doing. I had installed tracking software not just on Jessica's phone, but on Ryan's as well, after tailing them for a few days and finding an opportunity when they met for lunch. From there, I had access to everything: his emails, his schedule, his messages with other colleagues. It wasn't hard to piece together how he was manipulating Jessica professionally all while pressuring her to help him get a promotion. What made it all the more delicious was how easy it had been to set the dominoes in motion. I didn't need to break into their lives with force. I just nudged things along, making sure the right people received the right information at the right time. A few anonymous tips to Jessica's boss, subtly questioning her judgment and decisions at work. Another to the HR department, hinting at an inappropriate relationship with a subordinate. Then, a more direct approach with Ryan, an email to the CEO detailing his attempts to use Jessica to gain influence in the company, with just enough evidence to raise alarms. None of it was too blatant, nothing to immediately destroy their careers, but it planted seeds of doubt. Those seeds would grow into something much larger. I had time. I wasn't in a rush. Let them continue their little affair. Let them believe they were getting away with it. That was part of the satisfaction. Watching them build up this illusion of control while knowing I was the one pulling the strings. Jessica's demeanor began to change in the weeks following her trip. She became more erratic, more distant than ever before. I saw the stress in her eyes, the way she glanced at her phone constantly, as if waiting for something. Perhaps she was waiting for me to finally notice, to confront her, to start the inevitable argument that would end with tears and empty promises. But I didn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, I remained calm, played the role of the loving, oblivious husband, and let her unravel on her own. The unraveling became even more apparent when her professional life started to take hits. Her boss called her into several private meetings over the course of a week, questioning her judgment on certain projects, specifically her handling of Ryan. Though I wasn't privy to the exact details of the conversations, I could tell from the way she came home, shoulders slumped, that the pressure was mounting. Her texts to Ryan became increasingly desperate, filled with worry about their future and whether they were being too reckless. Ryan, true to form, brushed off her concerns. He continued to push her, demanding that she follow through on promises she had made about getting him a higher position in the company. The cracks were widening. It wasn't just Jessica's work life that was falling apart. She was losing control over her personal life too. She started drinking more, coming home late, even when she wasn't with Ryan, sometimes locking herself in her office for hours. I could hear her pacing, muttering to herself, as if rehearsing some kind of confession or excuse. But she never brought it to me. She was too scared. One evening I came home to find her sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television, a half-empty bottle of wine on the table in front of her. She looked up at me when I walked in, her eyes tired and red, but she didn't say anything. She just watched me, as if waiting for something, an argument, a confrontation, anything. I gave her none of it. "Long day?" I asked casually, shrugging off my coat and hanging it by the door. She nodded silently, not taking her eyes off me. "Yeah, work's been stressful." I smiled sympathetically, the kind of smile that a husband gives when he cares but doesn't really understand. "I'm sure it'll get better. Just hang in there." Her lips trembled, and for a moment I thought she might say something, might confess. But then she bit it back, taking another sip of wine, and turned her attention back to the TV. I went about my evening as usual, but the tension in the house was suffocating. I knew what was coming. The unraveling was almost complete, and soon I would pull the final thread. The following week, I received a text from Jessica while I was at work. It was unusual for her to contact me during the day, but this wasn't a casual message. "We need to talk tonight." That was all it said, but I could hear the desperation in her words. She was on the edge, ready to break. She wanted to confess, to unload the weight of her lies, but I wasn't going to let her do it on her terms. I replied simply, "Of course, I'll be home by 6. As soon as I sent the message, I put the next phase of my plan into motion. Jessica thought tonight was going to be a conversation between the two of us, a moment where she could explain herself, maybe even salvage what was left of our marriage. But tonight wasn't about us. Tonight was about her reckoning. I arranged for a small gathering at the house under the guise of hosting a dinner for a few of her colleagues and close friends. It was something I knew would catch her off guard, something she wouldn't have time to protest or back out of. I sent the invitations that afternoon, keeping the list short but strategic. Her boss, a few key figures from her department, and of course, Ryan. When I got home that evening, Jessica was waiting for me in the kitchen. She looked anxious, fidgeting with the hem of her sweater as I walked in. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I smiled, feigning ignorance. "Of course, but we'll have to be quick. I've invited a few people over for dinner tonight, just some of your colleagues. Thought it'd be nice to have a casual evening." Her face went pale. "What? Tonight? Where?" I shrugged, moving around the kitchen to pour myself a drink. I thought we could use some company. It's been a while since we've hosted anything, and I figured it would help take your mind off work. She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could, the doorbell rang. Our first guest had arrived. The evening that followed was excruciating, for her at least. I watched as she tried to hold herself together, smiling through the tension, exchanging pleasantries with her colleagues while her eyes darted toward me every few minutes, as if waiting for the other shoe to drop. Ryan showed up about an hour into the dinner, late as usual, his confidence radiating as he greeted her with a grin that only I could see made her wince. I bided my time, waiting for the perfect moment. The conversation flowed easily among the guests, small talk about work and upcoming projects. Jessica was quieter than usual, clearly on edge, but no one seemed to notice. They all saw her as the composed, capable woman she had always been. None of them knew what was coming. After dessert had been served and the guests were starting to relax, I stood up, raising my glass to offer a toast. "Thank you all for coming," I began, smiling warmly at the group. "It's always a pleasure to host such wonderful company. But before we wrap up the evening, I'd like to share something with all of you." I saw Jessica's hand tighten around her glass, her knuckles white. She knew. "I've been working on a little project of my own recently," I continued, "and I thought tonight would be the perfect time to unveil it." I walked over to the living room where I had set up the projector earlier that afternoon. "It's a short film, just a few minutes long, but I think you'll all find it enlightening." Jessica stood up, her voice shaky as she tried to stop me. "No, please, don't." But it was too late. I pressed play, and the room fell into stunned silence as the projector flickered to life. On the screen were the messages, her texts with Ryan, their plans to meet in secret, the intimate conversations they had shared while I was none the wiser. There were photos, too, grainy images of them together, leaving hotels, sitting too close at restaurants. Every piece of evidence I had gathered over the past few months, meticulously compiled into a presentation that left nothing to the imagination. I watched as the color drained from Jessica's face, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to form words but couldn't find any. Ryan, too, sat frozen, his smug confidence evaporating in an instant. The room was deathly quiet when the video ended. No one moved, no one spoke. The weight of what they had just seen hung in the air like a thick fog. I turned to Jessica, my voice calm and steady. "I know everything." Her glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor as she collapsed into a chair, her body shaking with silent sobs. Ryan stood abruptly, muttering something under his breath as he stumbled toward the door, but I stopped him with a single sentence. "You might want to check your email, Ryan. I'm sure your boss has some questions for you." His face contorted with panic as he rushed out of the house, leaving Jessica to face the fallout alone. I stood there, watching her as she crumbled under the weight of her lies, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when everything came crashing down. And it was better than I had imagined. The fallout from that dinner party was immediate and brutal. By the time the last guest had hurriedly made their exit, Jessica was crumpled in the corner of the living room, her body racked with silent sobs. I stood by the door, watching her. The cold satisfaction I had anticipated felt different now. It was there but muted. An odd emptiness hovered around the edges. I had accomplished what I set out to do. Jessica's perfect world had shattered, just as she had shattered mine. But instead of the rush of vindication I expected, I felt something much heavier settling in. Her cries echoed through the house. I didn't move to comfort her. She didn't deserve comfort. Not from me, not after everything. But still there was a pause, a hesitation inside me that I couldn't quite shake. I had spent months preparing for this, meticulously planning each step of her downfall, and now it was here, and I was watching her disintegrate just as I had intended. Ryan, of course, had bolted from the house the moment his name was exposed. I had checked his email earlier that evening to ensure the final nail in his coffin had been delivered. His boss, armed with the anonymous evidence I had provided, had scheduled an emergency meeting for the following morning. I imagine Ryan's desperation now, scrambling to salvage what little remained of his career, knowing that his affair had destroyed his professional life as much as it had his personal one. There would be no promotion for him and no upward climb on the corporate ladder. His manipulations had backfired spectacularly. And yet, standing there watching Jessica collapse into herself, I couldn't help but feel that the weight of it all was starting to close in on me too. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. "Why did you do this?" I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. What answer could I give her that would make sense? I didn't owe her anything. No explanation, no justification. She had betrayed me. That was reason enough. "You ruined everything," I said flatly. "You and Ryan. You brought this on yourself." She didn't respond. She just sat there, staring at the broken glass on the floor, her eyes vacant and distant. The once confident, self-assured Jessica was gone. In her place was someone hollow, stripped of everything she had once valued. Her reputation, her career, her affair. All of it was in ruins. I left her there and walked upstairs. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying the events of the evening over and over again. I had won. That much was clear. Jessica's life was in shambles, and there was no recovering from this. But as the hours dragged on, the taste of victory grew bitter. I had spent so much time and energy on this revenge, shaping my every action around it, that I hadn't considered what would come after. What now? What was left for me? The next morning, Jessica was still in the living room, curled up on the couch, her eyes red and swollen. I ignored her and went about my morning routine. I brewed coffee, ate breakfast, and checked my email as if nothing had happened. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. It was as if we were living in separate worlds now, her, lost in the ruins of her life, and me, untouched by the wreckage I had caused. As I prepared to leave for work, she finally spoke. "What are you going to do now?" Her voice was small, fragile. It didn't sound like her. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I had orchestrated her downfall, but I hadn't thought much beyond that. What was left for me here? "That's not your concern," I said finally, my voice cold. I turned and walked out the door without looking back. The next few days passed in a blur. At work, people spoke in hushed tones around me, whispers that I pretended not to hear. I wasn't naive. I knew the rumors were spreading. Some of the people at the dinner party had already started talking, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Word was getting around, but there wasn't much anyone could do. I had been careful, so careful, about how I executed everything. No one could pin anything on me directly. I avoided Jessica when I was home. She had retreated further into herself, spending most of her time locked away in our bedroom or in her office. The silence between us was suffocating. I could sense the tension, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air, but I refused to give her the satisfaction of closure. She didn't deserve it. Ryan, on the other hand, hadn't been able to handle the fallout. His career was effectively over. Word of the scandal had reached everyone in his company, and the incriminating evidence I'd provided had sealed his fate. He was fired within a week. I heard from one of my contacts that he had tried to appeal the decision, but it was no use. No one wanted to be associated with him after what had come to light. He was toxic now, his professional reputation destroyed. He left Jessica, of course. The moment things started to fall apart, he distanced himself from her all, likely hoping to salvage what little remained of his own reputation. But it was too late. Everything was too late for both of them. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. I had accomplished what I set out to do. I had torn down their lives, taken away everything they had built together. But what had I gained? That question gnawed at me relentlessly, creeping into my thoughts at all hours of the day. I was free of Jessica, free of the lies, the betrayal. But the emptiness that followed victory was unlike anything I had expected. I had spent so long plotting my revenge, shaping my life around the destruction of hers, that I hadn't considered what would come next, what was left for me in the aftermath. I tried to keep busy. I threw myself into work, focusing on new projects, burying myself in meetings and deadlines. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, the same questions kept coming back. Was this all there was? Was this victory worth the cost? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Jessica wasn't the only one who had lost something. I had lost too. I had lost pieces of myself in the process, pieces that I wasn't sure I could ever get back. One evening after a long day at work, I returned home to find Jessica sitting at the kitchen table. She looked worn, defeated. Her hair was unkempt, and there were dark circles under her eyes. She had lost weight, her clothes hanging loosely on her frame. She didn't look like the woman I had once loved. She looked like a ghost of herself. "I'm leaving," she said quietly, not looking up from the table. I paused, unsure of how to respond. Part of me had been waiting for this moment, but now that it was here, I felt nothing. No relief, no anger, no sadness. Just nothing. "Where will you go?" I asked. She shrugged, her shoulders slumped. "I don't know. I'll figure it out, but I can't stay here." I nodded. It was the most logical step. There was nothing left for her here, nothing to hold on to. She knew it, and so did I. "Good luck," I said, the words sounding hollow as they left my mouth. She stood, gathering a few bags that had been sitting by the door. She didn't say goodbye. She just left, closing the door softly behind her. And just like that, she was gone. The house felt unbearably quiet after Jessica left. I had always valued my solitude, but now it felt different. Now it felt like an echo of something lost, something I couldn't quite name. I spent the next few days moving through my life in a fog, going through the motions without really feeling anything. It was as if I had pressed pause on everything, waiting for some kind of answer to reveal itself, some resolution that never came. I found myself sitting at the kitchen table one night, staring at the empty space where Jessica had sat the last time we spoke. The silence around me felt oppressive, thick with the weight of everything that had happened. Was this what I wanted? Was this what revenge looked like? The questions I had been avoiding for weeks now demanded answers, but I didn't have any. I had gotten everything I wanted: Jessica's downfall, Ryan's ruin. I had destroyed their lives as methodically as I had planned, but in doing so, I had destroyed something in myself as well. The man who had loved Jessica, who had built a life with her, was gone. In his place was someone I didn't recognize, someone cold, detached, and hollow. I had won, yes, but I had also lost. Months passed and the rumors eventually died down. People moved on, found new things to gossip about, and my role in the entire ordeal faded into the background. I was left with my empty house and my empty victory, wondering if I would ever feel whole again. I wasn't sure I would, and maybe that was the real price of revenge. The knowledge that no matter how justified, no matter how calculated, there were no true winners, only survivors. I had survived, but at what cost? The answer to that question lingered, heavy and unresolved, as I moved forward alone into a future that felt uncertain and unrecognizable. I had taken control of the situation just as I had planned, but in the end, I wasn't sure I had ever really won. I watched as Jessica's face crumbled in real time. The video played in silence, only the sound of the projector humming softly in the background. Her betrayal, her lies were laid bare for everyone to see. I had planned this moment down to the smallest detail: timing, lighting, the exact sequence of messages and photographs. Everything was perfect. Her colleagues, her boss, even a few friends sat frozen, their gazes flicking from the screen to Jessica and back again, horror slowly dawning in their expressions. Ryan sat as still as stone, his jaw clenched tight, I could see the realization sinking into his mind. He had been outmaneuvered, trapped by his own arrogance. This wasn't just a personal humiliation for him. This was the end of his career, his future, everything he had leveraged on this sordid affair with my wife. He tried to catch Jessica's eye, but she was too far gone, too shell-shocked to notice his desperation. He'd never expected this kind of public reckoning. The final message on the screen lingered for just a moment longer, a text from Ryan to Jessica, where he urged her to get rid of me, saying I was holding her back. Then the screen went black, the room falling into a silence so thick it was suffocating. I let the moment hang, allowing the weight of what had just been revealed to sink in for everyone. I wanted them to sit in that silence, to feel the enormity of what they just witnessed. It wasn't just about Jessica's betrayal. It was about control, power, and how easily I had taken it all back from them. Finally, I stood, my movements slow and deliberate. I met Jessica's eyes across the room, and for the first time in months, I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no love. She had taken everything from me, and now I had returned the favor. The devastation in her eyes was complete. I know everything, I said calmly, my voice cutting through the tension like a knife. I've known for months. Her lip trembled, and for a second I thought she might try to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse or apology, but she didn't. She knew there was nothing she could say to fix this. Ryan rose suddenly, the legs of his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I should go, he muttered, his voice tight, strained. He shot one last glance at Jessica before bolting for the door. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't even try to defend himself. There was nothing left for him here. The guests began to murmur, unsure of what to do or say. Slowly, they too stood, their faces pale, their eyes wide with discomfort. No one wanted to be the first to leave, but eventually they shuffled out one by one, leaving me alone with Jessica. She remained seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as if she could physically hold herself together through sheer will. When the last of the guests had gone, I turned to face her fully. You've ruined everything, I said, my voice emotionless. Your career, your relationships, your reputation, it's all gone now. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Her shoulders slumped, the weight of her guilt and shame finally crashing down on her. She looked up at me, and in her eyes I saw nothing but defeat. The confident, vibrant woman I had once loved was gone, replaced by someone small and broken. I never wanted this, she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I laughed, the sound harsh in the silence of the room. Didn't mean for it to happen? You knew exactly what you were doing, Jessica. You chose this. You chose him. And now you're paying the price. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. But I couldn't bring myself to care. Any pity I might have felt for her had evaporated long ago. All I felt now was cold satisfaction. I left her there alone and went upstairs. The house was eerily quiet, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for the final collapse. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window into the darkness. For months, I had dreamed of this moment, of the satisfaction I would feel when Jessica's life finally crumbled. But now that it was here, I felt hollow. The victory rang empty. I had destroyed her. I had destroyed them both. And yet, something was missing. The next few days passed in a blur. Jessica remained in the house, though we barely spoke. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, her presence a constant reminder of the wreckage we had become. She knew it was over. There was no saving our marriage now, no rebuilding from the ashes of what she had done. The silence between us was deafening. Ryan's fate had been sealed as well. The fallout at his job was swift and brutal. He was fired within days of the dinner party, the evidence of his manipulation and unethical behavior too damning to ignore. I heard through whispers at work that he had packed up and left town, trying to escape the shame and humiliation that followed him. I didn't care where he went. He was irrelevant now. Jessica, however, lingered. She hadn't packed her things yet, hadn't made any move to leave. It was as if she were waiting for something, waiting for me to tell her to go, to end things once and for all. But I didn't. I wasn't sure why. Perhaps I was waiting for her to make the first move, to take some responsibility for what she had done. Or maybe I just wasn't ready to face the reality of it all. One evening, after another long, silent day, I found her sitting in the kitchen, a glass of wine in front of her. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red from crying, her face pale and drawn. She was a shadow of the woman she had once been. "I'm leaving," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I paused, unsure of how to respond. Part of me had expected this moment, but now that it was here, it felt surreal. I had imagined it differently, her leaving in anger and defiance, but there was none of that now, just resignation. "Where will you go?" I asked, my voice calm, detached. She shrugged, her gaze fixed on the glass in front of her. "I don't know. I'll figure it out, but I can't stay here." I nodded, accepting her decision without protest. There was nothing left to say. She stood slowly, gathering the few bags she had packed earlier. She didn't look at me as she walked toward the door. "Goodbye," she whispered, her voice breaking. And then she was gone. The house felt different after she left, quieter, emptier. I had thought that her departure would bring me peace, that I would finally feel free from the weight of her betrayal. But instead, the silence pressed down on me, suffocating in its stillness. I had won. I had destroyed everything. And now I was alone. I tried to fill the days with work, burying myself in projects and deadlines, but nothing seemed to stick. My mind kept wandering back to the events of the past few months, replaying every decision, every calculated move I had made to bring about Jessica's downfall. I had been so focused on the endgame, so driven by my need for revenge, that I hadn't stopped to think about what would come next. Now, in the aftermath, I was left with questions I didn't know how to answer. Was it worth it? Had this victory, this carefully orchestrated destruction, really brought me the closure I had sought? Late at night, I would sit in the living room, staring at the empty space where Jessica had once sat. The memories of our life together haunted me. The laughter, the love, the moments of happiness that now felt like they belonged to someone else. I had been so certain that revenge was the answer, that it would fix the pain she had caused me. But now all I felt was emptiness. The whispers around town eventually died down, as they always do. People moved on, found new scandals to gossip about. Jessica's name faded from conversations, and I became just another man living alone in a big, empty house. But the silence remained, a constant reminder of what I had done, of what I had lost. One evening, I found myself walking through the house, stopping in front of the mirror in the hallway. I stared at my reflection, at the man who had so meticulously planned and executed his revenge. But the man staring back at me wasn't the man I had once been. He was colder, harder, someone I barely recognized. I had taken control of the situation. I had exacted my revenge. But in doing so, I had lost something far more valuable than I had ever anticipated. I had lost myself. As I stood there, the weight of everything pressing down on me, I realized that there was no going back. The life I had once known, the man I had once been, was gone, and in his place was someone new, someone shaped by betrayal, by revenge, by the emptiness that followed victory. I turned away from the mirror, walking out of the house and into the cool night air. The sky above was dark, the stars hidden behind thick clouds. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the stillness, wondering where I would go from here. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I was alone now, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if that was a victory at all. In the days following the dinner party, the house became a hollow shell. The silence between Jessica and me was palpable, heavy with everything that had happened. I no longer had to play the role of the ignorant husband. My part was finished. And yet, I found myself watching her as she drifted through the house, as if waiting for something more. She was broken, just as I had planned. Her life, once filled with confidence and control, was now a mess of ruined relationships and shattered reputations. She barely spoke, her days spent aimlessly wandering between rooms, occasionally glancing at her phone as if hoping for some reprieve that would never come. Ryan had abandoned her entirely, vanishing as soon as the fallout from the dinner party began to ripple through their lives. He didn't want to be dragged down with her, and I had made sure he couldn't even if he tried. Ryan's destruction had been just as swift and decisive as Jessica's. His company wasted no time in dealing with the scandal. His professional reputation, once promising and bright, was now tarnished beyond repair. They fired him, severing ties as quickly as they could. No one wanted to be associated with a man who had not only manipulated his way into a company position, but had also done so by involving himself with a married woman, his superior no less. He had become a cautionary tale, a career ruined by ambition and infidelity. Jessica, meanwhile, faced the slow, painful disintegration of her own career. Word had spread through her office, whispers and rumors swirling around her like a storm. People no longer treated her with the respect they once had. They kept their distance, wary of getting too close to someone whose personal life had exploded so publicly. Her boss had already begun questioning her judgment before the dinner party, and now, with the full extent of her affair exposed, those doubts were cemented. The company didn't fire her, not right away, but the writing was on the wall. Her days were filled with tense meetings, awkward interactions with colleagues, and a growing sense of isolation. I knew it was only a matter of time before she was pushed out, whether through a forced resignation or a slow, methodical stripping of her responsibilities until she couldn't bear to stay. She was no longer the woman in control of her life, her job, or her future. And I watched it all unfold from a distance, detached, my role in their downfall invisible to everyone but me. I didn't regret what I had done. I couldn't. I had executed my plan with precision, destroying the lives of the two people who had betrayed me, and I had succeeded. But as I stood in the middle of the wreckage, a sense of hollowness began to creep in. I wasn't immune to the consequences of my actions. As much as I had tried to remain a silent manipulator, people talked. The rumors surrounding Jessica and Ryan inevitably led to me. Whispers about our marriage, about what I had known and when I had known it, spread through our social circles. No one could prove anything, of course. I had been too careful for that. But people talked. They always did. Friends we had once shared began to distance themselves from both of us, not wanting to be caught in the middle of a scandal that had grown too big to ignore. Some avoided me out of awkwardness, unsure of how to navigate the situation. Others, I suspected, didn't know how to reconcile the image of the calm, collected man I presented with the darker reality that they now suspected lay beneath the surface. It didn't matter much to me. Those friendships had always felt superficial anyway. Relationships built more on convenience and social obligations than genuine connection. But there was a growing awareness that I was no longer viewed as I once had been. People saw me differently now, perhaps not with judgment, but certainly with wariness. The whispers never reached the level of open confrontation, but they were there in the background, a reminder that while I had won my private war, I had lost something else along the way. There was a price to be paid for the kind of revenge I had orchestrated, and while I hadn't fully understood that when I began, I was starting to see it now. Jessica, however, bore the brunt of it. Her once vibrant social life dwindled to nothing. Friends, colleagues, even family members pulled away from her arm, unwilling to associate with someone whose life had spiraled so publicly out of control. I watched as she tried, half-heartedly at first, to rebuild, to salvage what was left of her reputation. But it was too late. The damage was too deep, too irreversible. I found her one evening sitting at the kitchen table, staring down at a letter from her company. It was a formal notice informing her that her position was being restructured and that she would need to step down within the month. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just stared at the paper as if the weight of everything had finally become too much to bear. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Jessica left not long after that. She packed a few bags, said a quiet goodbye, and disappeared from my life. I didn't ask where she was going, and she didn't offer. The moment she walked out of the door, I felt an odd sense of finality, as if the chapter of my life that had begun with her infidelity had finally come to an end. But it wasn't the triumphant closure I had once imagined. There was no satisfaction in her departure, no sense of justice served. I had won the battle, but the victory rang hollow. The house felt emptier, quieter in a way that was almost oppressive. The silence, once a welcome reprieve from the chaos of our unraveling marriage, now felt like a constant reminder of everything that had been lost. I tried to move forward. I threw myself into work, into rebuilding my own life. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, the same nagging feeling remained. Something was missing. Revenge, I had come to realize, didn't bring the closure I had hoped for. It didn't fill the void left by betrayal. It simply left a different kind of emptiness in its place. I spent hours reflecting on the choices I had made, on the steps I had taken to dismantle Jessica and Ryan's lives. I had planned everything so carefully, executed it all with precision. But in the end, what had it cost me? I didn't regret what I had done. I knew I couldn't have lived with myself if I had allowed them to walk away unscathed. But there was no denying that I too had paid a price. I had become someone else in the process, someone colder, more detached, more calculating. The man who had once loved Jessica, who had built a life with her, was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. And that, I realized, was the true cost of revenge. Months passed and slowly the rumors died down. People moved on, found new scandals to gossip about, new lives to dissect. Jessica faded from memory, just another woman whose life had imploded under the weight of her own choices. Ryan, too, was forgotten, his brief stint of notoriety replaced by newer, more interesting stories. But the consequences of what had happened lingered quietly in the background of my life. I had achieved my goal, but the satisfaction I had once craved was nowhere to be found. Instead, I was left with the knowledge that I had won a victory that had come at a steep and unexpected cost. I hadn't just destroyed their lives, I had destroyed something in myself too. One evening, as I sat alone in the now silent house, I found myself thinking back to the beginning, to the moment I had first discovered Jessica's betrayal. The hurt, the anger, the overwhelming need for revenge had driven me forward, had fueled every decision I had made. But now, as I looked back, I realized that the man I had been then, the man who had been so consumed by the need for justice, was no longer here. I had changed. The revenge I had sought had come, but it had left me hollow. And now, as I faced the future, I knew I couldn't go back. There was no undoing what had been done, no way to return to the life I had once known. All that was left now was to move forward, alone, into whatever came next. The house was quiet as I stood and walked to the door. The night outside was dark, the air cool against my skin. I paused for a moment, breathing in the stillness, before stepping out into the unknown. Whatever lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain. There was no going back. As I walked through the house for the last time, the emptiness around me felt heavier than ever before. Jessica's things were gone, the spaces she once occupied now vacant and silent. There were no more whispered conversations over the phone, no late-night excuses, no signs of the life we once shared. I had destroyed everything, deliberately, methodically, and now there was nothing left but the quiet. I had won. There was no denying that. Jessica and Ryan were both out of my life, their carefully constructed worlds shattered beyond repair. Jessica's career was in ruins, her reputation destroyed. Ryan too had fled, abandoning her at the first sign of trouble, proving he was as weak and cowardly as I'd always suspected. They had both paid the price for their betrayal, and I had watched it all unfold, just as I had planned. And yet, as I stood in the middle of that hollow house, a question I had been avoiding for months finally surfaced. Was it worth it? I had spent so much time and energy crafting my revenge, making sure every detail was perfect, ensuring their downfall was as complete as it could be. I had thought it would bring me satisfaction, closure. But now, in the aftermath, All I felt was a strange hollowness. The satisfaction had been fleeting, momentary. The power I had wielded, the control I had exerted, it had all come at a cost I hadn't anticipated. Jessica's departure had left me with something more than just an empty house. It had left me with an emptiness inside, one that I couldn't easily explain or ignore. I had won, yes, but the victory felt cold, like ash in my mouth. The person I had become in pursuit of that revenge wasn't the same person who had once loved her, who had built a life with her. I had changed, and the weight of that change was beginning to settle in ways I hadn't expected. I walked through the house one last time, stopping in the kitchen where Jessica had so often sat, her phone always within reach, her secrets always just beneath the surface. The memories of those moments, of the tension I'd felt even before I had proof of her betrayal, played in my mind. I had been so sure that uncovering the truth would bring me peace, that tearing down her life would restore some sense of justice. But justice hadn't brought me peace. It had only brought more questions, more uncertainty. I had spent months orchestrating this downfall, consumed by the need for retribution. And now, standing on the other side of it, I wasn't sure if I had truly won anything at all. I had become someone else in the process, someone colder, more detached, more calculating. The man who had loved Jessica, who had believed in the life we were building together, was gone. And in his place was someone I wasn't sure I wanted to be. I left the kitchen and made my way to the front door. Outside, the world felt different, quieter, darker. There was no going back now. The path I had chosen had led me here, to this moment alone. Jessica was gone, and with her, the life we had once shared. But I hadn't anticipated that in destroying her world, I would also destroy parts of my own. I stepped out into the night, the cool air brushing against my skin. The streets were empty, the silence outside mirroring the silence inside. I hadn't thought much about what came next. I had been so focused on the act of revenge, on watching Jessica and Ryan's lives crumble, that I hadn't considered what I would do once it was over. Now, faced with the future, I wasn't sure what that looked like anymore. Had it been worth it? That question lingered, unanswered, as I walked away from the house that had once been a home. There was no clear answer, no easy resolution. I had gotten what I wanted, justice, control, but in the process, I had lost something far more important. I kept walking, unsure of where I was going. The path ahead was uncertain, and for the first time in months, I didn't have a plan. There was no next move, no strategy to execute. All I had now was the aftermath, the consequences of everything I had done. I had taken control of my life, regained the power that Jessica had tried to take from me, but the cost of that control had been high. I had sacrificed parts of myself in the pursuit of revenge, and now I was left with the weight of those choices. Was it worth it? I didn't know. Maybe I would never know. Maybe that was the true price of revenge, the not knowing, the lingering uncertainty that followed even the most carefully executed plans. As I walked further from the house, from the remnants of the life I had once known, I realized that there was no going back. The man I had been before all of this, before the betrayal, before the revenge, was gone. What was left was someone different, someone shaped by the choices I had made. The road ahead was dark, the future unclear, but one thing was certain: I had come too far to turn back now. Whatever came next, I would face it alone, with the knowledge that some victories came with a cost too high to fully comprehend. The path forward was mine to choose, but the weight of the past would follow me no matter how far I walked. And so I kept walking, into the night, into the unknown.